Hello, everyone. I hope that you are all doing well and staying safe despite, the current conditions. If you're joining us from here in North Carolina, then you are experiencing probably some strong winds. Hopefully everyone is staying safe out there. I wanted to say thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Old News, where the fossils are old, but discoveries are new. My name is Laura Beth. I am your host, so I'm going to be keeping an eye on our live chat and just to make sure that we, answer all of our questions, or as many as we have time for. And with us, of course, is Dr. Christian Kammerer, the museum's research curator of paleontology, here to share his expertise and share some new research. So, hey, Christian.
Hey, Laura Beth. Good to see you.
It's good to see you too. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Trying, staying inside on a stormy day.
Yeah, it's kind of dreary outside. But I think
Got those
that you
Zeta
have
remnants coming up.
Zeta remnants. That sounds like a band name. I feel like the news that you're going to share with us is actually like kind of spooky, some
Yeah,
clawed animals.
it's kooky at least.
Yeah. So let's get into it. What's new?
Yeah, so this month we're going to be talking about a very weird group of fossil reptiles called Drepanosaurs. Um, Drepanosaurs are a pretty obscure group of animals. They lived only in the Triassic period, but I think they're really quite fascinating, and they've been the subject of a lot of recent research, including some just from the past month. Um, so Drepanosaurs, let me bring up my screen here. Can you see that?
Yep.
All right.
Weird
Yeah, so
Triassic reptiles.
they're one of the many very weird reptilian groups that lived in the Triassic period. So we've shown some of these uh, in old news before, and they're part of this really massive radiation of animals that are coming after the Permo-Triassic mass extinction, as reptilian groups are rediversifying in a lot of basically empty ecospace, so habitats that were basically, completely lost all of their animals as a result of that major extinction. And just to situate people in time, so here's our geological history here, showing all the different eras and periods. The Triassic is the first period of the Mesozoic era before the Jurassic and the Cretaceous. Um, and it's where you get the earliest dinosaurs, but they're actually only show up at the end of the period in the late Triassic. And before that are a lot of these other reptilian groups are much more diverse. So some of the most outlandish examples of those are things like the on the left here, this marine vacuum cleaner, Atopodentatus. In the upper right here, sort of this river dragon looking thing, Van Clevia. In the middle, this bizarre leg-propelled glider, Charavipteryx. In the bottom right, the long-necked Tanystropheus, Tanystropheus, which had a neck longer than the rest of its body. And then in the bottom left here, this is the skeleton of an animal called Aretmarippus, a Hoopasuchian, which we've talked about in a previous episode of Old News. So go check that out if you're unfamiliar, which is sort of a reptilian platypus combining the features of a lot of different other groups. So a lot of strangeness happening as reptile groups are experimenting with different morphologies in the Triassic. But one group that we haven't talked about before that I think may be the weirdest of them all is this group called the Drepanosaurs. So Drepanosaurs were initially discovered in the late 1970s based on this animal, Drepanosaurus itself, from the late Triassic of northern Italy. So from some of these nearshore marine and estuarine deposits found in the base of the Italian Alps. This is a nearly complete skeleton, unfortunately missing the skull of this animal, which was named Drepanosaurus ungual. And both of the elements of that name, the genus and the species, are very informative in this case, really aptly describe this animal. So Drepanosaurus means sickle lizard in ancient Greek, and ungual means claw tail in Latin. And if you highlight this skeleton here, you can see why that's the case. So most animals, the end of the tail is just, a regular vertebra. Drepanosaurus, uniquely among animals known at the time, has a claw on the tip of the tail. So this is a modified vertebral element that is articulated with the rest of the spinal column. So it was probably mobile, but it looks more like the claw you would see on a hand or a foot, with sort of a base for tendon attachment and then sort of this somewhat curved, pointed tip there. So really unlike anything seen in other fossil vertebrates. So that's the ungual part. Now, why it's called the sickle lizard? Well, if you look at the claws on its actual hands, two of them, so the second digit, it's kind of the pointer finger claws on each of the arms, are massively increased in size compared to all the rest. So it's a little hard to see on the fossil. So let's look at this in this skeletal reconstruction. We're here showing the tail claw, and there is that giant hand claw. So that second digit claw is so much larger than any of the others, and really also unlike anything we see in other fossil vertebrates. Another weird feature of Drepanosaurus is it has kind of these expanded neural spines above the shoulder girdles that would have formed kind of a hump in life. And other animals that have great expansion of the neural spines usually have pretty prominent attachment sites for tendons and muscles, either conferring strength to the neck, like in a bison to hold up that massive head, or in this case, more likely supporting some fairly massive muscles as part of the shoulder complex, and then them connecting to the arm muscles as well. So the arm itself is extremely bizarre in Drepanosaurus. This is a reconstruction recently made based on some three-dimensional specimens found in the American Southwest, so not found in Italy, but also referable to this animal, Drepanosaurus. You can see in D there, it does have that massive sickle claw. And if you're looking, so each of the bones of the arm has been color-coded here. If you have any familiarity with the anatomy of the arm, you can see that there's too many bones there. So let's compare this perhaps to a better known arm, something we might be a little more familiar with, our own human arm, where between the shoulder and the elbow, you have this single large bone, the humerus. And then the forearm is made up of these two elongate bones, the radius and the ulna, that then terminate in the wrist bones, the carpals, that then connect to the phalanges, which are our finger bones. And this basic setup is the case basically in all terrestrial vertebrates, all tetrapods. Anything that has arms, there's some variation on this, even if, in something like a whale, maybe the fingers are elongated to make flippers, or in a bat are elongated to make wings. They all have this same underlying homology of the arm bones. But if you look at Drepanosaurus's arm, you have the humerus there in sort of darker green. But then in the forelimb, where there should just be these two bones, there are 5 bones. So what is going on with that? It's actually taken a long time for scientists to suss out exactly what's happening with this. But this recent work suggests that what you're looking at here is, so we have the humerus there, humerus to humerus. I'm going to be connecting lines showing the homology of these different elements, which is fairly straightforward, although you can see that the humerus is around the same length just as that one claw on the second digit, which is very odd. Then the radius also sort of makes sense, connects to the humerus and then attaches to the wrist bones. But then the ulna actually isn't one of these elongate bones making up the forearm. It's become this enormous plate-like structure that's sort of like solely an elbow bone. And instead, where the ulna would be in most other animals, you have these very elongate wrist bones. So the wrist bones, particularly the intermedium in green and the ulnari in purple, have elongated to sort of become pseudo ulnae, and they are forming the most of the length of the forearm there. And they are then articulating with some other wrist bones and then the fingers directly. So it's a very strange setup. So you can see here comparison again of human arm compared to a Drepanosaurus arm, noting again just how ridiculously huge that sickle claw on the digit is, and sort of the really weird position of the ulna. And so this claw is striking and unusual and the only one of its kind. But it turns out that it's not the only animal out there that has these sorts of claws. And so in the past year, scientists have been describing a series of new taxa based on very distinctive claw types that turn out to represent new Drepanosaurs. That there are other genera out there that do have this expansion of some of the claws. And similar morphologies, but clearly different enough from the Drepanosaurus one to be recognizable as new species. The first of these two, which is shown in the upper left, so this is just the isolated claw. This is an animal called Anchestronicus. I should mention that both of these were found in Petrified Forest National Park, one of our most spectacular national parks in terms of its geological exposures, which is well known for these massive outcrops of Triassic rock, characteristic of what you see in the American Southwest in Arizona. And so these are coming from late Triassic deposits in the Carnian and the Norian of Petrified Forest National Park. But Anchestronicus, its name in Greek means fishhook claw, and you can see it has this very highly recurved morphology compared to the taller shape of Drepanosaurus. What you can also hopefully see in what's marked B there is that there are these very deep pits at the base of the claw. And there's also a strong condyle for attaching to that first finger bone, the phalanx there. So this would have been, have strong attachment sites for the tendons, attaching to pretty powerful muscles. And the same is true of this other one, which was actually just described in the past month. Also from Petrified Forest, Scibolonyx scapter. Scapter means digger in Greek, and this is something that we'll talk about in just a second regarding these powerful muscle and tendon attachments and the really bizarre arm morphology of these things. The genus name Scibolonyx actually means dung claw because this is a taxon whose remains were found as these isolated elements in what's called the coprolite facies in Petrified Forest, which is a stratum that is very, very rich in fossilized dung. So perhaps an unfortunate name for this thing to be stuck with, but it's appropriate.
Yeah.
Like the Drepanosaurs, they all have very, very apt names. And so
Hey,
there's
Christian,
been, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So before you go on, do you mind if I ask a few clarifying questions about
Yeah, not at all.
mostly about the first species of the Drepanosauromorph that was found? So Anne pointed out that the tail, the Drepanosaurus, Anne pointed out that the tail looks a lot like a scorpion tail. And so I know you said that that's a claw at the end of that tail and not a stinger, right? But is it possible that it could sting? And also, how would we know that in a fossilized record?
So venom transmission in fossil animals is pretty difficult to sort out. But generally, what you see in something that is venomous is there has to be some sort of means for it to transmit the venom from a venom gland to sort of the victim there. So like and if you look at a snake's fang, like a cobra or a viper or something, you'll see that it actually has a hollow tube on the inside that goes from the tip of the fang to the base of the jaw where the venom gland is. The same is true of a scorpion's sting, even though it's not bone, it's just chitinous because it's an arthropod. There are venom glands at the base of sort of the stinger, and then there are little tubules that actually connect it to the tip. So in a venomous thing like this, we would expect to see tubes. And that is not the case, as best as we can tell, in any of the Drepanosaurs. It just really does seem to be sort of a claw-like variant of a vertebra. So I don't think that these animals were venomous. There are, it's so difficult to tell what's going on in the fossil record. There are crazy examples of living animals that somehow they get around these things, like, hedgehogs, for instance, are not naturally venomous, but hedgehogs, some are known to chew chew poison from toads that they eat and then lick it onto their spines to sort of like steal the venom.
Self-anointing.
Yeah, self-anointing there. I mean, same thing is known in some other spiny mammals. You have weird situations, like there are various species of nudibranchs, of sea slugs, that feed only on jellyfish, and they actually absorb the stinging cells from jellyfish, so making themselves secondarily venomous. But also, like, there's a lot of wild things going on in nature, but those are all things that it's basically impossible to test in the fossil record. So I think there's no evidence for being venomous in any of these Drepanosaurs.
Right. Just a superficial similarity, right?
Yeah.
So my other question, not to throw us too far off track, but can you think of any animals that have a claw that's like as big as that claw of the Drepanosaurus? Like, it's like
proportional
a hammer.
to body size. No, I think it is. It's it's because it's ridiculously large. It's like the idea that the claw is the same size as the whole humerus, and bigger in terms of like absolute height and things. So yeah, I haven't really seen anything else like that. There are, other animals that have ridiculously large claws, but they're usually like longer and thinner. Like there's a group of dinosaurs called Therizinosaurs, whose name, sort of means scythe lizard, so similar to sickle lizard, that also have, single claws are more than a foot long there. But those were also larger animals. So the Drepanosaurs, I should mention, they're small-bodied animals. They're sort of like in the squirrel to rat sized. They're quite wee. Whereas Therizinosaurs, could have been like 30, 40 feet long. So
right.
I mean, they still had ridiculously big claws, but it's not quite as disproportionate as what you see in Drepanosaurus itself. And maybe something like Anchestronicus as well. We don't have the whole skeletons of these newly discovered ones from petrified forest. The claw morphotypes are definitely very distinctive. So, the scientists naming them, I think, had good confidence that they were new. But yeah, we don't know what the rest of the skeleton looks like.
Right. All right. Well, I will let you get back to the Dung Claw, our new species.
Yeah. So these all these animals, the combination of these really powerful claws and also this really heavily developed arm is suggestive of a lot of power behind the arm, and suggestive that it was doing something, either digging or tearing open the ground. And so some early suggestions would be that these are like burrowing animals. So moles also have, very powerful claws, very powerful arms, hugely developed for muscular attachment, for just sort of like forcing their way through the dirt. But some other Drepanosaurs have other information suggesting that these may not, it's not quite that simple of an explanation. So this is a different genus, also from northern Italy, from some of the same deposits where Drepanosaurus is found. That's called Megalanchosaurus. You can see this animal doesn't have the really weird ulnar and wrist morphology of Drepanosaurus, although it actually does have the ulnari and the intermedium elongated, so it's sort of partway to a Drepanosaur condition. But interestingly, so let's zoom in here on the hand. So you can see it has the 5 digits that most tetrapods have, but there's sort of like 3 on one side and 2 on the other that are opposing one another. So the claw on one side going one way, the claws on the other side going the other way, suggesting that there was opposability here. And so this is a pretty unusual morphology in vertebrates, but it is definitely known in at least one other animal, which is modern chameleons. So chameleons, they are insectivorous lizards that live sort of throughout the old world, most of them in Africa. And they are arboreal, so they mostly live up in the trees. And helping them out in that is this very weird hand morphology, where they have sort of the fingers look like they're kind of fused into mittens on either side, where it has 3 on one side and then 2 on the other. And this helps them grasp onto branches and twigs as they're moving through the trees. So this is the closest sort of point of comparison we have for Megalanchosaurus and other Drepanosaurs. Another thing of note is that there appears to be opposability to the feet as well. So this is a skeleton of an animal called Vallosaurus, which is another type of Drepanosaur, only known from juveniles. So this would have been a little baby Drepanosaur, also from the Alps of northern Italy. And so you can see on the feet there, it also has sort of like a big toe that is opposing the other ones. Another interesting thing about Vallosaurus that we also see in other Drepanosaurs is the really strong curvature of the tail there, suggesting that it was prehensile. So a prehensile tail, something that is seen in things like New World monkeys, like howler monkeys. That's also used to help grasp and move through the trees. So overall, these Drepanosaurs seem to have a morphology that is very chameleon-like, convergent on chameleons in a number of ways. It has those opposing digits for holding on to branches, the prehensile tail. So it probably, you could see in Megalanchosaurus, the first 2 digits were kind of splayed, so I don't think they were fused kind of into the mitten that you see in chameleons, but otherwise pretty similar. So I think there's good morphological evidence that these things were living up in trees, a lot like chameleons today. And I should note before expounding on that further that these Drepanosaurs, they may look superficially lizard-like, and they may be similar to chameleons in some ways, but they are not lizards. They are not members of the group squamates that modern lizards belong to. They're a much more basal group of reptiles. So here's this evolutionary tree of various reptile groups based on a recent analysis that finds the Drepanosaurs to be very, very early members of the reptilian lineage, whereas proper lizards are up here in this group, the squamates, and the large group that belongs to, the Lepidosaurs, which also includes the Tuatara from New Zealand. So they're much earlier divergence than those other groups. So these things have powerful digging claws, but also have very strong indications that they were arboreal and were up in trees. So where does that leave us with the life history, the habitat, and the sort of feeding behavior of these very weird creatures? Well, coming all together, it seems to be kind of maybe something like the silky anteater that lives in South America today. So these show arboreal specialization, so they're up in the trees. That claw on the tip of the tail in Drepanosaurus, maybe also helping it being prehensile, helping it to grasp onto branches. But with these massive claws, maybe for tearing open rotting bark or insect nests to get at potential prey in there. So seeming to be a animal that's eating grubs or colonial insects. And colonial insects are starting to evolve at the end of the Triassic. So we don't see them before then, but sort of the earliest members of the bee wasp lineages and the termite lineages are starting to appear in the Triassic. So maybe with these evolutionary radiations of various insect groups, you have groups of reptiles like Drepanosaurs evolving to feed on them. I should also note that this is not, Drepanosaurs are proving to be increasingly diverse. So it's not just these big clawed things like Anchestronicus, Scibolonyx, and Drepanosaurus that paleontologists are finding new representatives of. There's also other very strange morphologies. This is an animal called Hyperonectar limnaeos. Hyperonectar is known from the Newark supergroup. So these are late Triassic lake deposits throughout the East Coast, but this one was found in New Jersey. All the Hyperonectar ones are found from sort of the core Newark supergroup, which is around Newark, New Jersey. This is an animal that for many years in the literature was known informally as the deep-tailed swimmer, because the scientists who discovered it thought that that long tail was for sculling its way through the lakes in which it is found. And the name also means deep-tailed swimmer, directly Hyperonectar. More recent research on Hyperonectar has put doubt on the swimming hypothesis. It seems like the tail was not particularly mobile. It may have been fairly rigid and not really well adapted towards propelling a body through the water. The rest of the body also has these very long limbs with tiny hands and feet, which is not the sort of thing that you see in most aquatic animals, which usually have shortened limbs but then expanded hands to make them either, at the very least, something that might be have like webbed fingers, if not fully like into paddle mode. So more recent research on Hyperonectar suggests that it, like other Drepanosaurs, may have been living up in the trees, and possibly even that super large tail would have been camouflage, looking like a leaf up in Triassic trees there. So here's just one possible interpretation of Hyperonectar. So this is also just a weird critter with a weird tail, weird arms, but in very different ways than Drepanosaurus. So these are small-bodied animals, and it is small-bodied animals are preferentially excluded from the fossil record. So historically, Triassic fossils, it's been hard to find these sorts of things, but recently paleontologists who work on the Triassic have been focusing increasingly on trying to learn more about the small-bodied animals. So I think it's likely that yet more Drepanosaurs and will be found in the future, and who knows how broad, what kind of weird specializations will be found there.
Oh, I have so many questions.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Were you going to add more?
Oh, I was just going to say that, yeah, I know already, there have been in a few papers, there are undescribed specimens of other new Drepanosaur species that are not yet named. There's one known from a number of complete skeletons from the Nugget Sandstone in Utah in particular that I think is going to revolutionize what we know about the vertebrae of these things. So most of the work has been done on the arms and legs, but this Utah Drepanosaur also shows they had incredibly weird vertebrae, more like a bird's than most of what we'd think of as reptiles. So yeah, there's definitely still a lot to come on all the weirdness going on in Drepanosaur land.
Yeah, and it sounds like you said that Drepanosaurus was found in Italy, and for a while that was our main specimen to go off of for this group of prehistoric animals. But now we have found some all over the United States, it sounds like, possibly all over North America, at least, some in the Southwest and some in the Northeast. Maybe it would be like that.
Basically wherever Triassic deposits in North America are found, we're now finding Drepanosaurs. So they seem to have been quite broadly distributed.
So they're a lot more common than paleontologists used to think, or did they not really think about it just because, the fossil record, as you find more fossils, of course, you learn more. So maybe paleontologists don't make those kinds of assumptions if they only find a few fossils. Maybe they would not assume that it. Go ahead.
Historically, it was thought that it required pretty exceptional preservation to get something like a Drepanosaur, because tree-dwelling animals generally have a very bad fossil record. So most fossils, they need to be in water of some kind to be preserved. You can also get exceptional circumstances like things being buried in sand or mud. But generally, you want some at least adjacency to a body of water to ensure good preservation. And so like if you're in also like modern tropical rainforests are known for having highly acidic soils. So if you're in a really densely forested area and, let's say you're a squirrel and you fall out of a tree and you're then in the dirt there, if it's acidic, your bones just dissolve. So forested regions are generally very bad at preserving fossils. And we have a relatively poor understanding of what kind of animals were living in the trees, especially in deep time. So we get lucky in some cases where there are sort of these nearshore lagoons where you might have something like living up in the trees and then falling into the water and being preserved. And we think that is what is going on with like Megalanchosaurus and Drepanosaurus at least. You can also have, exceptional these Lagerstätten cases where something goes wrong basically in the ecosystem. So we've talked before about the feathered dinosaurs in China, which are preserved in volcanic ash, where it seems like there are birds that are flying over this lagoon, mostly living in the trees, birds and various types of feathered dinosaurs, and then falling into the water and getting covered with volcanic ash. There's a similar site in Germany called Messel, that's in an oil shale where we think that what's going on, there's a lot of tree-dwelling mammals and birds and bats known from that deposit that you don't really see anywhere else. And it seems that there was a lot of petrochemicals under the lake where these animals were living, and that you'd get a buildup of carbon dioxide or methane or another one of these toxic gases in concentration, and if it vented up, everything flying overhead would die and then fall into the lake and get preserved in the oil shale. But those are very, very rare circumstances, and so it has very rarely that we get a good understanding of tree-dwelling animals. The facies in the American Southwest, like in petrified forest, it doesn't seem to have been, like a lagoon or anything. But as the name indicates, it is petrified forest is known for its huge stands of fossil tree trunks. So that's not true of not every stratum at petrified forest had these trees there, but at least some of them indicate a fairly massive forested region in what's otherwise a pretty dry and desolate time in the Triassic. So yeah, it definitely makes sense to have some potentially tree-dwelling animals there.
Right. And so what kind of fossils were these, and how were they fossilized? I mean, did they look kind of similar to the petrified trees that you can find in Arizona, in the national park?
So these are all being found at microsites. So I mean, like I mentioned, Triassic paleontologists have, historically you were looking for large specimens. So you have some of these crocodile relatives that are very common in the Triassic, Rawasuchians, things like phytosaurs. They can be as big as 40 feet long. So you basically just walk the Badlands until you see a bone sticking out, kind of like what you do when you're hunting dinosaurs.
Right.
But that doesn't give you a great idea of what's going on at small scale. So these are both being found in sort of bone beds or otherwise concentrated fossil deposits, where basically you find a lot of little things at the surface, little bits of fish teeth or scales and reptile claws, and then are collecting everything and then preparing them out in the lab, sometimes in bulk, and then sorting through everything you have. And it's showing that there's a lot more diversity at small sizes than previously known for the Triassic. I mean, it was always suspected that there were lots of little things out there, but we just didn't have the fossil record for them. And so those are
Sounds really
things like
tedious.
Drepanosaurs, but also members of the true lizard and snake lineage, these early Lepidosaurs, and including both early squamates, potentially. Squamates you don't really see too much of in the Triassic. They start to diversify more in the Jurassic. But the ancestors of the Tuataras, these group the Rhynchocephalians, which is a different Lepidosaur clade, they are quite common in the Triassic. And at small size now, we know they're incredibly diverse.
Wow. So, man, it sounds so tedious collecting the microfossils. Do you think these are the kinds of fossils that the general public might find? They might stumble upon them if they're just in the Petrified Forest National Park.
It's unlikely. They're in the Triassic, at least. Microfossils are pretty rare, and they're generally concentrated in sort of a few unusual facies. In this case, these have been things that have been worked specifically by groups of researchers and their students for a few years now. Microfossils themselves, certainly. I mean, it's in invertebrates and some types of Cenozoic vertebrates you can find. Anyone can find pretty easily. For example, if you're in Badlands National Park in South Dakota, another one of the greatest sort of geological national parks. I mean, definitely, if you spend a day hiking out the Badlands there, which are sort of Oligocene, Miocene in the past like 15 million years. Likelihood is pretty high of finding sort of a mammal tooth or reptile bone or something. But yeah, these Triassic microfossils, you really need to know exactly where to look for them. Also, I should mention that like a lot of it is not looking specifically for, like, we think of like doing a fossil dig and like getting a skeleton out of the ground. If you work on Mesozoic mammals, for instance, the likelihood of finding like Mesozoic mammals, they're very delicate, mostly small-bodied things. Their teeth are the things that are mostly preserved, isolated teeth. And so for the past 100 years, mammal paleontologists who work on Mesozoic forms, they don't really like, dig for skeletons or anything, but they bulk sample. So you go to a place that has some small fossils there, and then you just collect, at times, tons of dirt or like sand, and then you will screen wash it. So that means you take all the sediment and you put it over screens of varying degrees of fineness, and then you usually just like run a hose over it. So it washes all the dirt out and leaves behind the larger fossils. And when I say larger, some of these mammal teeth are only a few millimeters long, so they're still tiny, but they're bigger than like a mud granule or hopefully like a sand crystal or something like that. And then begun the laborious process of picking them, which is, usually you'll take a chunk of this sorted fossil material, and it's still mostly sand, and you put it under a microscope with forceps or tweezers, and you just like process that and pulling all the fossils out. And sometimes you get lucky. Like I know at the Field Museum, they were bulk sampling some Jurassic sediment from Madagascar, and they had volunteers there who were working like every day. I think it took them 2 years to find the first mammal jaw. So
wow,
it took a very long time. So yeah, it's challenging. It's something like I have a lot of respect for Mesozoic mammal paleontologists for the amount of effort that goes into finding their fossils. And I think that's also part of the reason why Triassic workers like myself have been reticent to work on microfossils in the past, because you go somewhere like South Africa or Brazil where you can just like walk out and find a complete skeleton and then just like, oh, okay, here it is. This is great.
Wow.
Whereas putting the work in to find the really little stuff, it's tedious, but scientifically hugely informative.
Right. So do you think that we have any fossils like this, like from Drepanosaurs in North Carolina? Do we have any Triassic formation?
Oh, for sure. Like, yeah, the Triassic here in the Research Triangle in particular, like everything around here is Triassic rock that's fossiliferous. And so I personally have already found lots of fossils of various Triassic vertebrates from around here. But no Drepanosaurs. So I've not yet found, well, we have not recognized any Drepanosaurs. There are literally hundreds of unprepared blocks at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences of Triassic vertebrates that could house them, but nothing that I've seen that like yells Drepanosaur. But I'm sure they lived here. Like they're present in New Jersey in sort of correlated rocks of the Newark supergroup. The assemblages here are generally pretty similar in terms of what habitat is involved. Like this is also some like rift lakes with what's known to be heavily vegetated areas around here, because we have some facies locally to the south of Raleigh that have huge like tree ferns and early proto-gymnosperms. So we know there were trees around here. I think it's just a matter, these are small-bodied, delicate animals. It's difficult to recognize their fossils. But I will keep looking. I'm confident they will be found eventually.
Yeah. Well, we're almost out of time. I'm not seeing any questions from our audience in the chat, but I have one last question for you. You mentioned that we've got a lot of, what did you call them? Blocks of fossil material from the RTP formation? Yeah. So is that the kind of thing that, when things return to normal, COVID aside, can people volunteer to, help you, I guess, not, what's the term? Not dig through, but,
prepare them. Yeah.
Prepare. Yeah. Do you have volunteers?
We were always looking for volunteer preparators. It's a great way to, it can be a very calming exercise to chill out at the museum while helping make amazing scientific discoveries. So right now, with still in quasi lockdown in terms of the research wing of the museum, not letting any volunteers in there, unfortunately. But yeah, afterwards, definitely would be eager to have new volunteers. We have very skilled technicians that can train people up, even if you don't have any background in that sort of thing. So yeah, definitely keep it in mind for the coming year or so.
Yeah, check us out. We will, I'll try to find the link to that, throw it in the comments, or you can find information on our website. Of course, it might be some time when things return to normal.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's see. I'm not seeing any other comments here. So thank you all for joining us today. I am going to put some links in the chat before we, go dark, I guess. Before we end the live stream? Sorry, just what are words? So don't forget that we have the Ask a Paleontologist form. At any time, if you think of a question, if you're like mulling over all of this content, tomorrow, and you just have a burning question about Drepanosaurs, you can submit your question into our Ask a Paleontologist form, and Christian can answer it at the end of next week's program.
Next month.
Next month, thank you. Next month's program. So mark your calendars for November 19th. That is when we will have our next episode of Old News. And again, we don't know the topic right now because Christian decides, what new research to highlight the day before. So if you want to, you can subscribe to the Old News mailing list. And basically that just means that you'll get a reminder email the day of the program, and we will have bingo sheets in that reminder email, and we'll let you know what the topic is, so you can, decide if you want to tune in. And all right, thank you, Christian, and thank you, everyone watching. We really appreciate you joining us to hear about the old news.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Stay safe out there.
Yeah.
I took your line.